you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitacre. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitacre.
Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Whitacre, and we are recording an episode today of Yes and with Belinda Eraicho. Belinda was on my show once before, a couple months ago, and if you recall, Belinda comes from a lineage of Dene and Ashiwi, which is known to us in white people language as Navajo and Zuni. And she's located in the Southwest United States. And after a long professional career, she decided to give back to her communities by sharing her cultural traditions and life experiences. Today, we're taking a little bit of a different stance because last time Belinda was here, we talked about ancestral healing and intergenerational trauma. Today, we are going to talk about giving voice to our murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And we're going to talk about the REDress Project. And we're doing this today because November is National American Indian Heritage Month. And this was implemented back in 1990 by George W. Bush. And it's still, even though it was implemented in 1990, there's still a lot of people who don't realize that November is National American Indian Heritage Month. So this is the perfect time to talk about this. There's a lot of trauma in these communities, and I think this is a discussion worth having. So Belinda, welcome back to the show. It's really an honor to have you with us again today.
Good morning, Jennifer. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast again. Looking forward to the conversation. One of the things before we have this conversation, and you already indicated that this is Native American heritage, it's also an opportunity for us to bring voice and to educate the public about issues that are impacting Native people across the country, but also First Nations people in Canada. Mm-hmm. I thought that this would be a great opportunity to bring this issue forward. And, one of the things before we begin this conversation, Jennifer, I've been, for the last 2 weeks, I've been really in preparation for this podcast, really thinking about, the families and the women that have gone missing or murdered. And just want to remind everybody that let's not forget that each of these women and girls that have been murdered or missing is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone's friend, and someone's loved one. And my point here is that there's a human being behind each and every one of these statistics that we will be talking throughout this podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And, and I am in total agreement. And I would just like to point out to our listeners too, that, there are people who are missing in all cultures. And I think we need to bring more awareness to some of our minority cultures because it's not more important in one culture and it's not more important, based on skin color or race or, heritage or where you're from or what your background is or what your genetics say you are. The pain is universal whenever it comes to this, and the suffering and the trauma is universal. And it's time, I believe, that we come back together and do something about this instead of stay separate. Because there's way too much separation among the different races and cultures right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the REDress art exhibition was started by a woman named Jamie Black. Belinda, can you tell us a little bit about this REDress project and what that is?
Sure. So as you indicated, Jamie Black is a Métis artist in Winnipeg, Canada. And one of the things that she was really trying to do is to bring attention and awareness to the missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Canada. And part of her project was to collect 600 red dresses through community donations, which she was able to do. And through this medium, she was able to exhibit them in public places like parks, universities, museums, etc., to actually bring this awareness to the forefront. Her main goal was to really draw attention to the gendered and racial nature of violent crimes against Aboriginal women. And it's a visual image that you can actually see. It was, like I indicated earlier, it was displayed throughout Canada. But here in the United States, it was also displayed at the National Museum of American Indians in Washington, D.C. There's actually a YouTube video that, folks can take a look at and watch the video and kind of get the significance. And even though you may not know these women and these girls, it really brings your attention to this big issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also understand that the exhibition has been brought to the United States just to bring more awareness in a couple other locations as well. The movement, I think it's only 3 at this point. Cornell is one of them, and I can't remember the third one. But there have been 3 of these art exhibitions in the United States. So it's starting to grow awareness, not just in Canada, but it's also starting to filter down to us here in the States.
Yes, absolutely. And the significance, Jennifer, of the red is a very sacred and powerful color in Indigenous cultures.
Okay.
And her whole idea was that the red dresses were to call back the spirit of these women and girls whose lives they lost or who have gone missing. And that's the significance of the red. I know that was one of the questions you had raised in our last podcast that we had together.
Yeah. And so what you said, red is very sacred. Is there a deeper meaning to the red in the sacredness?
Well, if you look at like a lot of Indigenous people, there are typically 4 colors that represent the 4 sacred directions. There's white, there's either turquoise or blue, there's red, and then there's white. And in original teachings, those were the colors of the original peoples. So red is significant to the red people. And I think in some cases that was where the term red men came from.
Okay.
It was really to signify the Indigenous people of the world. Was a significant also of red. Red is also representation of fire in a lot of cultures. So it's the essence of the fire element. And so it is a powerful color, and it has many significance.
Okay. Well, thank you for that explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So can you give us a little bit of information on what has transpired in Canada as it relates to the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls?
Sure, I will do my best to do that. As we were getting ready for this podcast, as I shared with you, there are so many details and facets to this whole unfolding of this story. I want to apologize in advance, for some of the details that I may leave out, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview of kind of what has happened. In Canada, did you realize, Jennifer, that they never even actually had a database for missing people until 2010?
Wow, no, I didn't know that.
Which is kind of ironic. And so I'm just going to kind of walk you through some historical events that have happened.
Is that missing people in general, or is that just
Missing
Indigenous?
in general.
Wow.
Missing in general.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
That is astonishing to me.
Yeah. And in 2011, there was a Canadian report. This is the first Canadian report that came out, and it was covering a period between 1997 to 2000, which was a 3-year period. And what they determined was that the rate of homicide or murder for Aboriginal women was actually 7 times higher than other females in the area, meaning non-Indigenous or non-Native people. And then in 2013, the commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police initiated another study to try and identify how big of an issue this was. There was eventually a report that was then issued in 2014. And in that report, the main statistics that came out of that there were 1,000 Indigenous women who were actually murdered over a 30-year period of time. And the number of Indigenous women who were victims of homicide increased 9% of all female homicide victims in 1980 to 224 percent in 2015. So this was almost an increase of threefold.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other statistic that came from this was that from 2001 to 2015, for a 14-year period of time, the homicide rate for Indigenous women in Canada was actually 6 times as high, as opposed to the non-Indigenous population.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another report that got issued. I won't go into details on that. But as a result of all of this, in 2016, because of all of the Indigenous groups, the activists and others, concerned about the incidents of murdered and missing women, it was brought to the attention of the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau,
Mm-hmm.
who then established a national inquiry into this issue. And there's a whole nother conversation around the statistics. When you get into the statistics that were actually reported by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, one of the things you got to keep in mind that those were only cases that were actually reported and typically only where the Royal Canadian Police patrolled the area. So if you're talking about rural Indigenous communities, that was not even non-existent. So to me, those statistics are kind of not actually showing the truth or telling a true story of what has happened.
Okay,
And
so that threefold increase is probably much, much higher.
Yeah, I would, yeah. And as we go through the rest of the unfolding of this story, it gets pretty interesting. And then also at the very end, I want to do a comparison between what has happened in Canada and what it has happened in the United States, because I'm starting to see that there's some parallels, just in a different context.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I understand that some of these murders were associated with a particular highway,
Mm-hmm.
and it's been referred to as the Highway of Tears. Can you
Yes.
talk about that a little bit?
So the Highway of Tears is actually a term that was given to a stretch of Highway 16 that runs from Prince George to Prince Rupert in British Columbia. And the phrase was actually based on a 1998 vigil for 4 murdered and 2 missing women initially. One of the things that happened over time was that there were 19 women that were killed on this particular stretch of highway. There were also, in addition, 49 women from the Vancouver area who were actually murdered by the serial killer. I don't know if you remember this story, but the gentleman's name, the murderer, was actually Robert Picton. He was actually, I believe, a pig farmer. And there's a whole nother story that is around that whole issue.
Yeah, I do remember that story.
Yeah, and then so there's a big disparity as we're going through these statistics between what has the police are actually reporting and what government and Indigenous communities are finding their own real experiences that are happening. So on this particular stretch of highway, on the Highway of Tears, it is estimated that there have been more than 40 murders and missing women.
Mm-hmm.
And just recently, and I was just sharing this with you earlier, a book just came out. It is called The Highway of Tears. And in that particular book, it goes into each of these stories of these women and these girls. Some of these girls were as young as 14 years old, 15 years old. Really tragic stories. So as I indicated earlier, my point is that there's a big gap in the numbers due to, who and where they were being reported at.
Yeah. What are some of the reasons why they're not reporting?
Well, one of the things, as I've started to read through some of the materials and read through some of these experiences, first of all, I want to bring up the point that a lot of the issues really stem from colonialism. Mm-hmm. So you put a people onto a reserve or a reservation, and they're trying to make a living and be economically dependent or independent. And one of the things that happens is there's a lot of social ills that go around that. In particular, with this particular highway, one of the things that you find is that a lot of Indigenous communities, whether First Nations in Canada or Native Americans in the United States, we don't always get a lot of the public services that other people get.
Okay.
like in urban areas. So for instance, public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the main reasons that a lot of these women and girls were on that highway in particular is, some of them were going to go see family members, so they would get on the road and hitchhike.
Okay.
Or they needed to go to school, or they needed to work in the next community. So that was kind of some of the reasons why they were there. In the first place, that put them in they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Mm-hmm. Goodness. And I understand, and this is something I think I can speak to for a minute. I understand that some of these were not reported because some of the girls might have had some interactions or been in trouble with the law. And
Yes.
as a trauma specialist, people who are traumatized are more likely to have interactions and be in trouble with the law than people who are not dealing with trauma within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times the acting out behaviors and become really distorted, and we're more likely to take risks and think that, have problems with authority and, do things that would be considered illegal or risky behaviors. And so there's a lot of trauma in the Indigenous and Native American communities too. And that holds people back, and again, I don't know that that's completely related to any race, because I see it in other races here in the United States, where people who are traumatized, other minorities, even in really urban, not urban, even in rural, poor white areas, there's more likely to be, crime and issues with authority in some of those more traumatized areas.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Some of the stories, as I was reading through this particular book on this particular highway, it talks about some of these young people who had run-in with the law enforcement, and so when they went missing, the assumption was by the law enforcement that they were just out with friends partying, or they were doing something, or being in a place where they shouldn't have been. And so in a lot of these instances, it wasn't until 3-4 days, sometimes a week or 2 weeks, that even though the family kept on trying to go to the police to, file a missing persons report, they didn't honor that. And so, and then the other thing you got to think about too is, if you're a young person, you've already been in trouble with the law, and something happens to you tragically, like, whether it's abuse, physical abuse, or sexual abuse, the last thing you want to do is go to the police for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times are a lot of the reasons why there's a lot of underreporting, not only just in Canada, but also in the United States as well, because we have the same issue on a lot of our reservations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So you talked a little bit about what's going on in Canada. What were the results of the inquiry by the Prime Minister?
Well, interesting enough, after the report came out, the report actually came out on June 3rd, 2019, just this year.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a group of commissioners that actually went through this report. And at the very end of the summary, one of the commissioners actually said in the report and in public that this was an epidemic, quote, a Canadian genocide, unquote. Buehler, who was head of the commission, went on to further state that there's an ongoing deliberate race, identity, and gender-based genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And so they recognized that there was a big issue with this. The report further went on to say that, quote, we convey truths about state actions and inactions rooted in colonialism, colonial ideologies, built on the presumption of superiority and utilized to maintain power and control over the land and the people by oppression, and in many cases by eliminating them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that was some really strong points. There were actually 2 separate reports that ended up resulting from this inquiry. And there were over 700 recommendations that came out of this. And from my understanding, there's only a few that have been implemented.
Wow. And genocide is a really strong word to use in something like this.
Yeah, and coming from a group of independent commissioners,
Yeah.
that says a lot. One of the interesting things is, because of the change in the leadership, the policyholders from the time that this report was issued to who now runs the political offices.
Mhm.
That is, from my understanding, the reason why a lot of these recommendations have not been implemented, because some don't feel that it's important enough. And one of the things, as an Indigenous person, as a Native person, that's the story we always hear
Mhm.
is, it's not important, you're not important enough.
Mhm.
And so, that's some of the themes that I will share with you as we go through this, the
Yeah.
rest of this podcast.
Right. And the colonialism, or just, you could even call it just the power over paradigm. That's not just an Indigenous problem here. It's a worldwide problem for Indigenous peoples around the world. Um, where, this power over has come in and tried to force their way of life on the people who already lived there before,
Mhm.
they came.
Yeah.
And we're seeing, we've been seeing in the last few years that doesn't work. I think there's this grassroots push for cooperation and collaboration, whereas there's still this, the people in power are still trying to force the power over instead of letting the people cooperate and collaborate the way we want to.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the things that you mentioned as we started to start this podcast, Jennifer, was that we all need to live on this same planet together, and we need to learn to get along with each other. I just started reading a book on white fragility.
mhm,
And it was really interesting. It's an eye opener for me because it's so foreign to me.
mhm,
And not too long ago, I was with a friend of mine, and I was asking her to explain to me what white privilege is.
mhm,
Because from my viewpoint, I don't have any concept or understanding of what that even means.
mhm,
And as I started to read this book on white fragility, and one of the aspects, and I encourage everybody to read it, it's really an eye opener because
mhm.
it really gives you a whole nother perspective of our history, not only here in the United States and in Canada, but around the world,
Yeah.
and how there was this need to conquer,
Mhm.
to take land for, wealth.
Right.
And it's really gotten us to this point was it absolutely nowhere.
Mhm.
And so that's one of the other points I wanted to make. And so I encourage folks to read those books as well.
Absolutely. And I agree with you 100%, Belinda. It's important to understand the history, of our own race, and as well as other races, because, the last time you were on here, we talked about ancestral and intergenerational trauma. And if you don't understand where you come from, then you a lot of times don't understand the motivation for why you do what you do and why you treat other people the way you treat other people. And, you know, those of us who hail from Europe, we have a long history of fighting amongst ourselves and
Mhm.
just fighting and not being able to get along with anybody.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
a long, and that's just the truth. There's a long history of white people not being able to get along with anybody. We have to go in and conquer. We fight amongst ourselves in our own families. We don't have a lot of cooperation, within the family unit. And that's important to understand that if you're ever to overcome that trauma.
yeah. I'm sure that you're feeling this as well, that there's a big shift happening
Hmm.
around us.
Yes.
And the truth about the things that were always not very truthful are coming out.
Yeah.
And more and more of that, I think, is going to start to unfold itself, including what
Mhm.
we're just talking about the racism and
Yeah.
the whole historical aspect that relates to all people.
Exactly. Exactly. And if we can understand, if we can start to read a little bit more about Indigenous peoples and how there was in early tribal cultures a lot of cooperation and collaboration and cohesive, um, units, where people lived peacefully together, that helps us understand as white people, where you're coming from. And if you can understand our fragility, that helps understand where we're coming from. And then we can start to work together.
Right. It's all
So
a learning. It's all
yeah,
a learning experience, and I'm
exactly.
one to not come across as angry or upset. I see it as an opportunity for us to learn together and to grow
Yes.
together. So
Yes.
yeah.
And none of us like the power over paradigm. And I
Yeah.
think I think that part of the white fragility is people are starting to see, white people are starting to see other people rise to power, and they don't know what to do with it. And that's a threat.
Yeah.
They see that as a threat, and it really isn't. It's to see it as a threat speaks to our trauma and speaks to where we come from, not what's really happening in the world. It's just simply a cultural interpretation of what's happening in the world, which doesn't make it right just because that's how you interpret it. Everybody
Absolutely.
interprets it differently.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's kind of shift gears, Jennifer, and let's talk a little bit about kind of what's happening in our own backyard here in the United States.
Yep, that's what I was getting ready to do. Thank you.
I'm
Thank you
reading
for
your mind.
You are.
One of the things that I shared a little bit about in our last podcast was about some of the statistics related to violence of Indigenous women here in the United States. Indigenous in the sense that I kind of use synonymous with Native American, American Indian, and Alaska Natives. We're all the same. Recent statistics from the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control, reported that murder is the third leading cause of death among American Indian and Alaska Native women. In addition, violence on reservations can be up to 10 times higher than the national average.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can imagine that, what that says is even me as an Indigenous Native person, that I too am a part of that statistic. It makes me vulnerable, or it's a risk that I have to take when I go out into the community. The other statistic that was kind of interesting is that 84% of American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced intimate violence from their intimate partners, sexual violence, or stalking. And this was actually a statistic that came out of the Department of Justice in 2016, which is, to me, it's telling. There's also 50% of American Indian and Alaskan Natives have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. Again, this was from the same organization. There's the statistics go on and on. And it's on the reservations, on some reservations, the murder rate is actually 10 times higher or even higher. Because of the points that I made earlier, a lot of it is underreported or just doesn't go reported.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of issues related to that.
Okay. And I understand that there are jurisdiction issues whenever there's a murder on a reservation. Can you talk a little bit about some of those jurisdiction issues and how that's a problem?
Yes. One of the things before I get there, while we're talking about statistics, that I wanted to share with you.
Okay.
There's an organization called the National Crime Information Center, which is the database that is used by criminal justice professionals here in the United States. And one of the things that was really interesting in looking at this report was that there was actually a little over 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women, girls, and women. And only 116 were actually logged into this database.
Oh, wow. And what's the time frame on those missing women? Is there a time period?
The time period was that they looked at was in 2016.
Just 1 year?
1 year.
Oh, wow.
So, what does that say to what happens to the rest of the 5,596? Don't they matter? And the story goes on and on that's similar to this, which is really tragic. And
that's heartbreaking. That's beyond tragic. Oh my gosh.
Yes, yes. And one of the other statistics that we haven't even touched on, Jennifer, is the urban Indians that actually were in all of our major cities across the country. Mm-hmm. As part of the assimilation process policy, historically, a lot of Native people ended up moving into the cities, either forcefully or voluntarily, to find, a better quality of life, whether it was to find jobs, to get educated, etc. And there are a lot of statistics around that. There were actually, across the country, when you talk about major cities, there's 128 missing person cases, 280 murder cases, and 98 cases which are kind of unknown. So again, the follow through is not consistent, and that's the thing that I've been talking to you about. Interesting enough, I'll read to you the top 5 cities where these issues are actually happening are Seattle, Albuquerque, New Mexico. I know that you were just there in that area.
I
recently.
did. I just got home Tuesday.
Anchorage, Alaska, Tucson, Arizona, and Billings, Montana. Those are your top 5 cities where you have a lot of kind of similar issues going on.
Okay.
So there's something to be said about that, and the real need to fix these databases and the reporting process for murdered and missing women and girls. And to answer your question about the challenges around law enforcement, there are challenges and barriers related to accessing information from law enforcement agencies, especially for communities and tribal nations and policymakers. In order for them to really understand how big of an issue it is, they need to have that data. And sometimes that data is not always available because either they weren't keeping track of them. In some instances, some of the evidence was actually disposed of. And so there's no real way to go back and look at that. And so part of the issue is that here in the United States, we have an issue with regards to jurisdiction. So for instance, if a white male ends up murdering a Native American person on a reservation, the local police force, the tribal police, do not have jurisdiction over that because that was the way that the law was written. They have to elevate that to the federal level, which in our case, and here in the United States, is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. And, when you really think about what's on their plate, and if it's just one murder on a reservation versus a big crime that's happening somewhere else, the focus is, chances are it's going to end up going to the bigger issue, and not so much going into looking at this investigational issue on the reservation. And where this stems from is there was actually a Supreme Court case that happened in 1978 where the Supreme Court ruled that tribal courts do not hold any jurisdictional power over non-American Indian and Alaskan Native, and therefore cannot prosecute or punish them for their crimes. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is that in 1968, through the Indian Civil Rights Act, it limits the maximum punishment for any crime to $5,000 and 1 year prison time. And so again, there's these loopholes in the system that do not allow for justice to take place for these families and these victims of,
That's just mind-blowing to me.
It is mind-blowing.
That is absolutely mind-blowing that somebody who's not a Native American could go onto a reservation and commit a murder and nothing could happen other than $5,000 and a year in prison.
Yeah.
Or did you say jail or prison? Because there is a difference. Prison. Okay. 1
year prison time. And so now you can understand from a Native American woman's perspective, if I am raped or some kind of violence has happened to me from a non-Native person, what's the point in even reporting it?
Right.
Because either it will just get thrown out of court or nobody will even do anything about it.
Right. And I think most women can relate to that because most women in this country, it doesn't matter what race we are, if we're raped, we have a hard time reporting it because we know the rape kit is going to sit there. We know that nothing is going to happen. But this is a whole other layer of why bother? It's just heartbreaking and astonishing to me.
Yeah, it is.
It really is, because it's a whole other layer that I wasn't even aware of.
Yeah. So, when I look back at, all of the pieces of information that I went through from all of these experiences in Canada versus what's happening in the United States, there are a couple of themes that I see. The quite obvious one is the lack of reliable and consistent reporting of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That's the biggest problem.
Yeah.
The other thing is reporting only occurs in certain areas where law enforcement is active. So if they're out in a rural reservation somewhere, chances of it being reported are none.
Okay.
The other thing that, as I kind of touched on at the beginning of our podcast, we touched about colonialism. There's a big social condition for First Nations and Native American as a result of colonialism of Indigenous people that we need to understand, because when you bring a people down and you put them in poverty and they never really have an opportunity to really care for themselves, it sets up a whole set of barriers for them. You know, just like the women on the highway, you know, they didn't have access to any kind of public system. Now they do. They started running a bus line through that area, but again, it's not consistent enough, and it's actually subsidized. So if you got people that are in poverty and they have to choose between getting on a bus, paying for a ticket to get on a bus, versus putting food on the table, what are they going to do? They're going to put food on the table.
Right.
And so you don't set things up for Native people or Indigenous people to be successful from the get-go.
Right.
So that's one of the other biggest issues that we have. But here in the United States, there's some initiatives that have been happening to try and bring this issue to the forefront. Here in Arizona, recently, there was a bill 2570, which actually established a committee to actually do a comprehensive study of how big of an issue this is here in the state of Arizona. And I know that there are some other states that have been really proactive in looking at that. You may be familiar with, in 2017, Congress approved the Savannah Act. I don't know if you recall that.
I don't.
Yeah. So Savannah Graywin was a 22-year-old pregnant member of the Spirit Lake tribe who was tragically murdered in 2017. And as a result of that, this particular bill, our act, was actually put in place. And it really put in place some of the initiative to try to get the Department of Justice to move on some of these issues, including providing training for law enforcement agencies of how to record victims into their federal database. Again, that's kind of key. Develop and implement a strategy to notify citizens of different systems that are out there and then available to them. Conduct outreach to different tribes so that they can become educated as what they can do as a tribe to, help and protect their women. And also develop guidelines for response to missing and murdered cases as well. So there was a whole list of actions that actually came from this. In addition, there's other things that are happening in different communities. There's a young lady who's 17 years old, and she's from the California area. And she actually wrote a play, which is called Menil and Her Heart. And it's actually a play that she's written and she's dedicated to murdered Indigenous women. So for your listeners that happen to be in that particular area, I know that she has a show that's going to be happening on the 17th of November, which I just think is coming up really soon in the that California state in Santa Bernardino area.
Okay.
And then there's other things that are happening. Just recently, I think last week, there was a quilt that was actually donated to, or actually given to the governor of the state of North Dakota, because he's really trying to raise the awareness of this issue in his community. And it was a way for him. He had actually paid a visit to some of the reservations and really try to understand what some of the social issues were, and to give him a better context of why this was so important. And so I think some of our leaders really need to get out there, get out from behind their desk and really know what's going on out there in their communities.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of the other issue that I see. And one of the points that I kept bringing up is I think there's a bigger issue here, and we kind of touched on it before we got on this podcast, about colonialism and racism.
Yeah.
And it's something that we cannot we cannot look at it, sometimes because either our own history with our ancestors, or for some other reason or experience that we may have had. But it's so important that if we are going to coexist as human beings on this planet, we really need to understand and look at those issues. And even if it's uncomfortable, that's where the growth and the healing begins, as you well know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you can't heal unless you go through the discomfort of feeling the pain and feeling the discomfort of the pain, because that is part of the healing process.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and these difficult conversations about our racist tendencies,
Right.
that has to happen for healing to occur.
You know, one of the things, Jennifer, that as I look at these types of issues like intergenerational trauma, and I look at our own history here in the United States, and I look at this issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, I couldn't help but go back and look at our original documents of this country, like the Constitution. If you go back and you look at the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause, and in that it states that, quote, nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And for me, as an American, as a Native person, that's not true for me, because I don't see that happening in our communities. We're not protecting our women. We're not protecting our girls. And because of the way that the system has been set up, it doesn't allow us to be successful.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And, like I said earlier, this is a whole other layer, because in many cases, women across the board are not protected. And I'm not sure that there's awareness. And I'm so grateful that you came back on the show to bring awareness to this, because I don't think there's enough awareness as to how vulnerable women are in minority cultures, especially Native American, Indigenous, and Alaska Native cultures.
Yeah. You know, one of the other, and I'm glad that you're doing this as well, because I think the media has a big responsibility in getting this information out. It's really interesting in some of the stories that I read through, and as much as the families try to go out and reach out to the community to do, hit the radio stations to get the word out that they're missing a loved one, a lot of times they were refused that. And then in one instance, I believe it was in the Vancouver area, there was a young lady that went missing. And within 24 hours, it was like a massive media blitz. All of the news stations had her on TV, were posting her pictures, everything. And unfortunately, when it comes to Indigenous people and Native American people, we don't get that attention.
Yeah.
And so it's really the responsibility of the families to go out and doing their knock on the doors, print their posters, etc. And so I think media also has a big role in this and has a big responsibility. And sometimes, I understand also that when it comes to the national news or the local news, that they have their own pieces of information that have to be presented. But at the same time, those things are just as, people's lives are just as important.
Right.
Indian lives and Native American lives and First Nations lives are just as important as well.
Exactly. Oh, absolutely. And, I'm not sure that the media is ever going to hold themselves accountable. The media is so scripted and they're told what to say. We don't have investigative journalists to the extent that we used to, back even when I was a kid. We don't have the Walter Cronkites and the Dan Rathers anymore. We have people who just read the news, and they say what they're told to say. And I would hope that people would start to take personal responsibility for where they consume their news. Let's stop turning to the mainstream news, because it's all scripted and it's fear mongering and it's meant to keep us divided. It's a lot of opinions and people talking back and forth. And we have, excuse my language, we have a saying where I come from, it's like opinions and assholes. We all have them. It doesn't mean yours is any more relevant than mine, And it is,
Absolutely.
it's true. You know, it's like your opinion's no different than mine, or no
Yeah.
better than mine, or no worse than mine. It doesn't make mine more relevant. So if we all would take personal responsibility and start looking to where the real news is coming from, a lot of times there's more real news that actually comes across from live feeds of people actually out in the streets during protests saying, look, this is what's happening in my city right now, or, you know, like podcasts like we're doing right now,
Absolutely.
to report what's really going on. So I would hope that people will start to take personal responsibility. And I really think like you're a force to be reckoned with, Belinda. Thank you so much for, for, you know, really raising awareness to these issues and talking about them, because that's how we're going to do something about them, is to have people talk about them and to have awareness of it.
You know, sometimes it's not an easy thing to name a lot of these issues in our society that are broken.
Mm-hmm.
They are issues that cause tension between different races, which is the whole race subject is a whole nother story.
Right.
When you actually read where the word race comes from and how we started as a nation and as a, you know, global community, how we started separating who was white. And there's a whole, it's just fascinating when I read through some of the history about how did these terms come about, who was actually behind them, who
Mm-hmm.
decided who was brown and who was black and who was white, you
Right.
know, and it's just fascinating. But going back to the point about the media, I think it really is an issue of integrity.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really a personal and a professional um, ethics issue, you
Yes.
know, that you have to live with yourself if you're a reporter or if you're a news anchor or etc. You know, you have to live with yourself in terms of, are you really in it just for the money? Are you really in it for what you originally had planned to go to school for,
Right.
which is to
Exactly.
report the truth?
Exactly. Exactly. And so what are some of the actions that people can take individually? Like what do you recommend?
So there's, I think, a couple of things. You know, I had mentioned some of the different projects that are happening, like the REDress Project.
Mhm.
Those are all of the exhibitions that this young lady puts out there is all through donations. You know, you can make an investment there and get the word out that way. One of the biggest things, I think this is a start, is to educate yourself on the subject and get involved. You can also get involved by you know, participating in your legislative process. If you happen to be in one of those states where this is a big issue, you know, there's a lot of bills and legislation that's actually going to the leadership for approval to help, first of all, identify how big of a problem do we have, and then also providing the resources to change this picture that
Mhm.
we continue to see. There are also marches. One of the things that I do every year in the springtime is we here in Arizona, we have a march for the murdered and missing women. And, you know, I go out there and I march with everybody else to help bring awareness that this is a big issue and we need to take care of one another. And then the other thing is, you know, as I indicated, media has a big play in all of this. And we can all get out there just as I'm doing and really make our voices heard for those that don't have a voice.
Mhm.
You know, there needs to be some resolution to a lot of these stories. It just breaks my heart when I read stories about a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old.
Mhm.
And I was like, you know, she never had a chance to live her life,
Right.
you know, to its fullest. And those are
Right.
kind of the situations that we have to deal with.
Right. And I would also add to that is, you know, for the average person, you know, you're talking about, you know, people as young as 14, 15, you know, teenagers, young women. Look back at your life, you know, for all of our listeners out there. And did you make the wisest decisions when you were 13, 14? I put myself in, when I was a teenager in my early 20s, I can't count how many times I put myself in situations that I look back, I'm like, oh my God, I was so stupid. Why did I do that? Why did I go there? Why did I think that was okay? Our brains, if you look at the development of the brain, we are hardwired when we are teenagers and we're going through all these hormonal changes, and we look at how the hormones affect the brain, and we look at brain development. Our cortex, our cerebral cortex, is not fully formed and it's not fully functioning until our mid-20s. And that's for men and women both. For women, it's somewhere around 22, 23, 24. For men, it's about 24, 25, 26. So when you have a not fully formed cerebral cortex and hormones pumping through your system, you are hardwired to make poor decisions.
Mhm.
And why would we vilify anybody for, their physiology? And like you said, some of these girls had run-ins with the law. That happens in all cultures. Why vilify one race over another for the same exact behaviors? So we need to start, calling a spade and saying we all do it. We all make poor decisions, and let's not vilify one race over another, and start to have compassion for everybody, and start to have justice for everybody, and treat everybody like human beings, like the human beings that we all are.
Yeah, I think one of the other things, Jennifer, that is so important is there's, for this particular issue, there's a long history,
Mm-hmm.
and where we are right now, we have an opportunity to learn from all of that.
Yes.
And if we don't learn, we're going to repeat it again and again, as we have with many other things in history.
Right.
Um, so it's an opportunity for us to work together. We have to live on this planet together.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start somewhere.
Yes. And another mistake that we as the colonial race has made is we have labeled minorities as savages throughout
Mm.
history for centuries. And there was a study, I'd have to go back because I learned about this from Dr. Gabor Mate in a class that I'm taking with him right now. And there was a study, I'm not sure if it was MIT or Harvard, I think it was a Harvard study, where they have determined that the ideal scenario for raising children, so you have healthy, happy, trauma resilient children, is pre-colonial Native American, indigenous tribal cultures where there are about 75 to 100 people. And he even says that there was one particular tribe that would say, for the first 2 years of life, our babies, their feet never touch the ground because they're held so much and they're loved so much and they're coddled, and there's so much attention given to the children that they have secure attachment, and it really gives that strong foundation. So if you really look at the truth, who's the savages?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we've got to go back and relook at history from a different angle, from a different perspective, and stop believing that our perspective is the only one that's correct, because research is showing differently.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because if you go back to our Constitution
Mm-hmm.
for the United States, it specifically mentions savages in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we really are going to change the context of who we are as Americans and reunite again, that's the first place we need to start. We need to remove
Yes.
that,
Yes.
because it doesn't have a place in this time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it was again, propaganda in the 1700s, that still has filtered through epigenetically to today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Belinda, this has been such a powerful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show again, to raise awareness. Like I said, I think you're just a force to be reckoned with, and I appreciate you so much.
I appreciate you too. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you for allowing to bring this topic to the forefront.
Yes. And before we sign off, do you have any final tips or bits of wisdom to leave with our listeners today?
One of the things that I wanted to leave everyone with is, as you start to learn about these particular topics, please understand that each number that you read through, each statistic that you read through, like I said earlier, is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother, grandmother, loved one. And that really puts a human being to each of those numbers. And I think we've forgotten about that. And we need to get back together as a human race to understand each other and to lift each other up instead of trying to bring each other down. So that's kind of my wisdom.
Amen and aho.
Oh, thank you so much, Jennifer. You have a beautiful day.
Yes, thank you, Belinda. And for all of our listeners, if you want more information about Belinda, visit her website. It's kalogii.com, and that's spelled KAALOGII.com, where you can find more about Belinda, services, events, and you can find her blog and everything that she does. If you want more information about me or my podcast, go to jenniferwhitacre.com, and that's where you can find more information about me, my services, and the Yes and podcast. So for now, this is Jennifer Whitacre signing off, and I will see you all next week.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes and podcast with Jennifer Whitacre. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitacre.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.